So on behalf of the Status Coalition, I do want to welcome you to this event as we mark September 11 once again, 6 years later. Dr. Sunera Thobani, so I'm glad that she's here with us. When she spoke out, she was vilified and targeted and silenced, and when she was silenced, we were all silenced too, to speak out against what's going on. Because soon after what happened with 9/11, we had the occupation of Afghanistan and occupation of Iraq and the regime, the security regime here in Canada. And that's what we're talking about today.
What I would like to say is that on this anniversary of the 9/11 attacks, we need to take stock of the impact of those attacks and of the subsequent war on terror, which was launched by the United States and its allies in response, which includes, of course, Canada. The impact of the invasions and occupations of Iraq and Afghanistan have been devastating for those populations, and by some accounts have led to the deaths of hundreds of thousands of people. We cannot forget that. But I want to focus today on the impact that the war on terror has had here in North America, in the US and in Canada. Canada, of course, continues to remain a staunch ally of the United States in the war on terror. And so I believe that we have a special responsibility to understand what this war is, to continue to oppose the occupations of Afghanistan and Iraq, to call for the withdrawal of Canadian troops from Afghanistan, and to oppose any further escalation of this disastrous war, to include Iran. It is true today that many people in the United States, many Americans, are opposed to the Iraq war than they were when the war started. Indeed, CNN reported a poll yesterday, just as General Petraeus was readying to present his report on the impact of the troop surge to the Joint House Armed Services and Foreign Relations Committee, that 53% of Americans thought that the general's report would not really reflect what is going on in Iraq, and that it would be just so much propaganda for the White House. These Americans turned out to be right, because General Petraeus did indeed report that there was an quote-unquote overall improvement in the situation in Iraq, which defies the reality on the ground in that country. The BBC reported a poll, again, as General Petraeus was presenting his report in Washington, that 70% of Iraqis say that the security situation in Iraq is worse today than it was before the surge. And the political debates in the United States today are really about how and when the American troop withdrawal should be organized. That's what the political debate is. Yet the violence continues, and yet the support for the war in Afghanistan continues to shape Canadian government policy. Afghanistan, of course, is also proving very hard for them to hold, as we are all aware. Canadian troops have suffered many attacks as a result of the Taliban resurgence, and many Canadian soldiers have lost their lives. Public opposition to having Canadian troops in Afghanistan is also building solidly. And in Canada, our first priority should be the call to have Canadian troops withdrawn immediately. We have to strengthen our demands for this, but in this talk I want to focus on three key issues that remain priorities from my perspective and that we tend to not pay a lot of attention to often in the public discussions of the Canadian participation in this war. The first point that I want to talk about is what the war has actually accomplished, what it has done successfully. And for me, one of the changes that the war has accomplished is how states now deal with the question of sovereignty. This war has enabled the United States to restructure its sovereignty, and it now claims a globalization of this sovereignty, largely through the suspension of the rule of law at the international level. This has had profound consequences for all of our rights, including our citizenship rights, and it will continue to have profound consequences for the foreseeable future. The war, of course, revealed very clearly, to an unprecedented degree actually, the relationship between law and violence. Violence is law, and the law is violence. That's what we've seen most clearly in the US response to the 9/11 attacks. First, the notion of sovereignty has been completely transformed within this age of empire, as is the case with the US today. US sovereignty is being defined by the Bush administration as not contained only within their national territorial borders. US sovereignty is being defined as global. And by that, what I mean is that the Bush administration has argued, with the support of many other states, that any threat anywhere on this planet to US interests allows them to respond to defend their interests. In effect, this means that US sovereignty is global, whereas that of other countries is not. And US allies, including Canada, are supporting this expansion of US sovereignty. We are facilitating it. But the situation gets even more complicated when we look at the cases where Muslim citizens of other countries, including in Canada, have been named as terror suspects. Of course, Maher Ara remains the most important and the most clear example of this, although others are also being held today in Canada on security certificates as terror suspects. Among the other very distressing things about these cases is that they point out that Canadian citizenship of these Muslims have been overridden by the charge of terrorism that has been made against them by the United States. And in such cases, the interests of the United States in defining these men as suspects are deemed more important than protecting the rights of these men as Canadian citizens. What this illustrates, I think, is that US national interest now overrides citizenship rights of Muslims in Canada. And thus US sovereignty overrides Canadian sovereignty in the case of those who look like Muslims, those who can be branded as terrorist suspects, and those to whom such charges can stick. Muslims all around the world now are subject to US power, regardless of whether they are US citizens or not. And so the question I ask is, how much will our citizenship be worth when we can be constructed as enemies of the nation? Targeted assassinations in many parts of the world of terror suspects are now becoming normalized. They are becoming publicly sanctioned. And again, this is a very, very disturbing development. And the war thus far has been successful in bringing about this change. The second point I want to make is that while racism against Muslims has certainly increased and has received our attention, but when we talk about racialization, I think it's really important to recognize that whiteness and Westernness is also a racialized category, and that is also being transformed as the racism against Muslims is increasing. The racialized aspect of the war on terror has meant that the racism that is directed against Muslims and those who look like Muslims, which is basically black and brown bodies, has received newfound sanction, newfound legitimacy in the name of national security. The targeting of Muslim communities by surveillance agencies, by the anti-terrorism measures, all of this increases and justifies the racism that already has existed in Canadian society, but it's taken it to greater heights. In many ways, I want to argue that the racism that is targeted against Muslims today actually strengthens white supremacy in the Western societies that we live in.